One of the most commonly recommended pieces of communist literature is, and has been for a while, the Communist Manifesto. Makes sense. If the recent spate of far-right politically motivated terrorism that's been #trending in the US and parts of Europe for the past couple of decades is anything to go by, the best way to understand what someone's political beliefs are is to read their manifesto as a PDF online after they've died. The manifesto is, IMO, a pretty good summary of what communists are and what they want, while also pushing back on some misinterpretations of the theory and also some possible counterarguments. Unfortunately, it is also crusty as hell. Shit was published not only 150 years ago, but in a different language and by some of the biggest nerds in Europe at the time. So that's where this video is coming in. I'm trying here to simplify and summarize the contents of the manifesto, while also pruning some parts that aren't super relevant in the 21st century, and adding some bits that will help connect it to your life today. First, the context though. I know, I'm sorry. I'll try to keep it somewhat interesting and relatively short. The Communist Manifesto was published in 1848 by an organization of communists in London. Many of them were Germans, and thus it was originally published in the German language. Ironically, despite the fact that it was published in the capital of the English-speaking world, it would take 2 full years before the manifesto was translated into English. Right at this time, there was a huge wave of revolutions spreading throughout all of Europe. All of these revolutions were different, and it's far beyond the scope of this video to discuss even one of them in depth. But a common theme of them was that oppressed people were now rising up against the establishment that ruled their country. Among many of these oppressed people were new emerging ideologies, from anarchists to communists to syndicalists to social democrats and so on. These ideologies had all been developing alongside the march of industrial capitalism that had been all the rage in Europe, and the communists wanted to set themselves apart. So the manifesto was written. Clocking in at a whopping 23 pages in the original German, the manifesto was really little more than a pamphlet, designed to make it easy for average workers to read and understand what the communists wanted. Unfortunately, it came just a little too late and was pretty much confined to the German-speaking world during these revolutions, and all of them across Europe were basically quashed by their various enemies. But the manifesto would see a resurgence in the following decades and go on to become one of the most popular revolutionary texts of all time. Okay, history out of the way. The manifesto is written in 4 main parts. The first section is the introduction, clearly, and explains very quickly what a communist is. The second section, titled Bourgeois and Proletarians, gets much meatier and shows how communists fit into the development of the world at large and where the issues that they were facing in 1848 came from. The third section, Proletarians and Communists, starts by defining the terms communist and capitalist and how they relate to the aforementioned proletarians, before clarifying some misconceptions about what those groups are and what exactly they want. The last section, Socialist and Communist Literature, talks about various kinds of ideologies that are similar to communism, and most importantly, how they fall short of the OG. Before we get started, I want to make a quick note about terms. Lots of terms in this reading are complicated, half-translated, and/or confusing words that are difficult to understand and even more difficult to spell. Given that this video is designed to make things easier to understand, I will be replacing words like bourgeoisie with easier to understand terms that mean something very similar, like business owner. Just know that if you do decide to read the text yourself, which I highly recommend, it's linked in the description, you'll find that the more complicated term is the norm, and actually does mean something just a little bit different. All right, let's dive in. A specter is haunting Europe. The specter of communism. Or, if you're reading the original English translation, maybe it's a hobgoblin. I think I prefer it that way myself. Either way, all the rich and powerful people in Europe aren't huge fans of it, and they're working together to stop it. The religious power of the Pope, the feudal power of the monarchists, and the economic power of the business owners are all collaborating to stop the glorious hobgoblin of communism. Based on that fact alone, we can figure out 3 things about what communism is. 1. Communism is a legit threat to those people's power, otherwise they wouldn't care. 2. Communism must be cool as hell, literally, in the case of the Pope. And 3. Communists need to openly and firmly state their beliefs to avoid these incredibly powerful groups twisting their words. So, here they go. Them communists stating their beliefs in their own words. Chapter 1. Bourgeois and Bourgeois and proletarians. To explain what communists want, we have to go back to the beginning. The branch of social science that infamous raccoon man Karl Marx worked in, called political economy, indicates that European societies grew primarily through internal battles over resources. Basically, the have-nots fighting the haves. The form of this fighting changes, but there's always been some sort of conflict. In ancient Rome, there were the patricians who owned everything and served in the Senate. And then there were the plebeians and the slaves that did all the work. In the Middle Ages, there were the kings that owned everything and controlled everyone. And then there were the peasants that actually did all the work. Now, and I know this is revolutionary, there's the business owner who owns all the businesses and get their say in Congress. And then there's the workers, who do all the work. These large groups of people that play different roles in the society are called classes. And what defines them isn't as simple as one person having a lot of money and the other person not having very much, despite what the ghouls in DC would have you believe. The main difference between a worker and a business owner is how they make their money. Workers work. Wow. And business owners receive profits from the companies that they own. Of course, this is oversimplified, and there is important nuance missing, but that's a topic for another video. If every single one of you watching likes and subscribes, and also mails me a crisp $20 bill, I might make that video at some point. Here's my address. Anyways, people who benefit from this class system like to tell us that they abolished class when they cucked the kings. That's clearly not true though. They merely swapped out the kings with CEOs. And if you don't believe me, just take a look at how much the US Congress cares about your opinion based on your income. In fact, these new classes of business owner and worker are even less complicated than the previous system of kings and peasants, especially at the time the manifesto was written in 1848, though it has admittedly grown a little bit more complicated since then. So, if the business owners are in charge now, where did they come from? Well, in the Middle Ages of Europe, most people were peasants, and they were pretty much the property of the kings and lords who officially owned the land that they lived on. This meant that most people lived in the countryside and spent their days planting and harvesting wheat, barley, and other stuff like that. But the kings still wanted to trade for the things that they couldn't get from their peasants, and so they would charter some people to conduct trade for them. These people were referred to as the burghers in Germany, or in France, the bourgeoisie. They were usually richer than peasants and lived mostly in cities where they would do their trade. Then this little thing happened that you might have heard of, where Christopher Columbus stumbled ass backwards into the Western Hemisphere. Because the people that lived there didn't worship the right God, suddenly everybody in Europe decided that they could steal all of their land and stuff, sending all of that super valuable stuff to Europe. This increase in trade made the burghers very, very rich. There was so much stuff, in fact, that the guild system, which was how Europeans at the time coordinated the processing of raw goods into processed goods, think making lumber into furniture and so on, had become too restrictive and slow to respond to this sudden wave of cool new shit coming from the Western Hemisphere. The burghers, who saw that they could make so much more money if only they could find a more efficient way to process all of this shit, started taking the problem into their own hands and hiring poor people to come into one big building and work together on turning this stuff into things that can be sold. This was called the factory system. As Europeans continued to conquer and plunder the Americas, Asia, and later Africa, more and more materials came into Europe, and eventually even the new factory system began to get stretched to the limit. So the burghers started to invest in new technologies that could make this work more efficient. This was the birth of the concept of automation. As these changes began to make the economy more and more efficient, the owners of these factories, the burghers, benefited more and more until they became as wealthy, or even wealthier in some cases, than many kings. In fact, many of the rules that kings placed on trade in their kingdoms at this time were designed to restrict the power of the burghers. This naturally began to breed resentment in the new quote-unquote middle class, so-called because they were between peasants, the lower class, and kings, the upper class. These conflicts got more and more intense until the last few decades of the 1700s, when the business owners flipped the table and started killing kings. You might have heard of a couple of these incidents, just little things called the French and American Revolutions. The concept of a capitalist republic, think the modern-day US or France, became the hip new way of organizing society, and the kings that used to be the upper class were now replaced by the rising class of business owners. In fact, many kings were even absorbed into the business owner class and became little more than business owners with shiny hats. At this point, everything had changed. The middle class was the top class now, and they wanted to remake the world in their image. So, as you might expect from a group of people that had literally become the most powerful people on Earth by maximizing profits, they applied that money-making hashtag grind set to everything in their lives. Part of this, which they had actually been doing for centuries at this point, included something called the enclosure of the commons, dividing this land up into neat parts and selling them to the business owners. Real quick, if you're an unwashed Yank like me, you might not know exactly what the commons is, so here's a quick definition. The commons is a fancy British term for land that had been something like a public park. Shared land which had been used by peasants to graze their animals, grow their food, and more or less live off of. When this land was sold to private landowners, the peasants didn't have a way to make food for themselves anymore, so they had to move to the cities to get a job. This was the birth of the yang to the business owner's yin, the working class. This working class, removed from the farming culture that they had grown up in, had to adopt the culture of the ruling business owners in the cities to make sense of the new world that they lived in. This, importantly, included the way that the business owners viewed the family, which was primarily as an economic unit. Men, who were at this time the only people allowed to own things, were the quote-unquote breadwinners, responsible for going into the world and making the money that their family needed to live, while women, who were viewed as the property of their husbands, devoted their lives to the work of birthing and raising children, as well as doing all the household chores, or, if they were rich, just yelling at the servants to do it. Children were viewed as investments, something that men had when they wanted an additional income stream, or someone to care for them when they got old. As much as certain types of people on the internet today would like to make this structure seem ancient, this view of the family as an economic unit didn't really come into its own until the era of capitalism. That's what this whole system is called, by the way. Capitalism isn't merely the concept of selling things to make money, which has been a fundamental part of human existence since things started being made. Capitalism is a global economic system that places the class of business owners, or capitalists, at the top of the economic totem pole. This position also gives them the power to control the structure and direction of not only the economy, but politics as well. Like I said, the surfboard that the business owner class used to ride the wave of history to the top spot on the totem pole was the pursuit of profit. The profit incentive, if you're crusty. The profit incentive didn't stop there though. At the time the manifesto was written, the pursuit of profits was driving not only the plundering of basically everywhere that's not Europe, but was also developing a new way of exploiting non-Europeans by installing capitalism in their countries, and then offshoring the jobs that were originally done in Europe to these newly colonized countries, where workers could legally be paid far less than their European counterparts. As capitalism began to grow across the world, this created the largest and most economically productive global empires in world history, which, among other mostly evil things, created a global social and intellectual community as well. Something you might have noticed about the development of capitalism throughout this tour of European history is its tendency to centralize things. It centralized the economy from the guild system into the factory system, it centralized the ownership of shared land into the hands of the proto-capitalists, it centralized people physically into emerging cities, and it even centralized the world itself into the possessions of a handful of European empires. It wouldn't be honest to deny that this centralization didn't result in the creation of a world that would be completely unrecognizable to a medieval peasant. The economy was the most productive and efficient that it had ever been, technological progress had exploded, and now goods and people were truly living in a global community. The issue is that the profits of these developments were also centralized into the bank accounts of a handful of super rich dudes. All of this progress itself is what destabilized the feudal system, which was designed for Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire a millennia earlier. This is what caused the revolutions of the 17 and 1800s, as the political systems in charge were no longer able to do what was needed to support the people. Looking back, this is very important to remember because it is the position of the communists that the capitalist economic and political system has reached a similar breaking point. The profit incentive, which was originally a progressive force in world history, creating an economy that was capable of serving all people's needs, was now a regressive force, creating artificial barriers to the meeting of people's needs. Just one example of many. The system that had been created to make enough beds for all people was now the same system that was not allowing those beds to be distributed to all people because it wasn't profitable. Not only that, but the profit motive is inherently growth-oriented. To keep profits coming in, the economy must grow constantly. But the economy at this point was large enough to already support the needs of every person in pretty much any given country. This led to the creation of something that was completely new in all of human history: overproduction. The almighty profit motive was now creating far more things than people actually needed, only to throw them away or hold them merely as investment vehicles while barring actual people from using them. This might not sound like a particularly big issue at first blush until you put a little thought into it. Let me give you an example. If we are overproducing wooden furniture, that means that we're cutting down more trees than needed. And if the amount of furniture being made must get bigger every year to satisfy the growth demand of the profit motive, then the amount of trees cut down each year must also grow every year. This leads us to a situation where 10% of the entire planet's forest biomass is destroyed in only the last 100 years. With that in mind, I'm sure you can see exactly where I'm going. The current climate crisis, which as it stands, is poised to cause an ecological collapse of biblical proportions that could threaten the very existence of humanity. That's a result of carbon emissions, right? Well, even setting aside the entire question of fossil fuels in and of themselves, it is absolutely undeniable that at least a part of those emissions are coming as a direct result of overproduction. Basically, the profit motive demands infinite growth on a finite planet, meaning we are destroying our literal home and food chain in order to turn around and throw away the goods that we're producing. Let's put a pin in the talk of the impending apocalypse, though. Simply by virtue of creating a global economy machine that incorporates people and their work as a fundamental part of that machine, capitalism reduces complex, unique people into nothing more than cogs in the economy machine. This cogification of humanity is accelerated by the way that specialized job training is extracted from the creation of goods. That doesn't make any sense. Let me give you an example. In 1300, a chest of drawers was something that was built by a highly specialized, well-paid, respected, and trained artisan, a position similar to the way that we see architects today. But in 1900, that exact same chest of drawers is produced on a conveyor belt, partially by steam-powered machines, and partially by an underpaid, faceless person that hates their job and is treated like garbage just for not having a high-prestige job. In a capitalist economy machine, just like actual cogs in actual machines, workers are completely interchangeable, and so they must compete with each other for the same spot in the machine. This new labor market is flooded with new faceless people who no longer have any choice but to work because bills gotta be paid. Food and housing now cost money, and they need to make that money in order to have access to them, or they starve. This increased competition drives wages as low as possible, keeping workers just barely alive, but not comfortable enough to stop working. These wages are kept low by investing in new automation and bringing new people into the workforce. At the time of the manifesto, these new people were mostly women and children, both of whom were legally allowed to work for far lower wages than men, as their work was seen as inherently less valuable. Not even the business owners themselves can escape this trend either, as the poorer business owners are inevitably pushed downwards into the working class when they can no longer keep up with larger businesses' prices and are driven out of business. If you've ever been in a small town with a new Walmart, you've seen this effect firsthand as mom and pop shops that have been a part of communities for decades are driven out of business by the impossibly low prices and inevitably shady business practices of global corporations. Now, as shitty as all of this seems, I'd like to step back and say that while the manifesto does clearly have an agenda, it is literally the Communist Manifesto. This first section thus far has simply been an explanation of the development of the economy as it happened, beginning in the Middle Ages and ending in 1848. Going forward, the communists will now advocate for the working class to do revolution, but the role of a communist isn't to tell the workers what to do. It's to join them and support them when they inevitably do get pissed off at the people that are oppressing them and begin to rise up. When things suck, people get mad, and communists want them to help express this righteous anger. This next section explains in a mechanical way how the material conditions of work under capitalism inevitably result in unrest. And work under capitalism definitely sucks, for all of the aforementioned reasons. So workers inevitably do, and will rise up against these conditions, just as the burghers did against the feudal kings centuries ago. Historically speaking, these acts of rebellion began as small individual actions where one or a handful of people would destroy the factories that they worked in and the machinery that they used. But these actions don't really result in any major changes. So the tendency is for workers to join together in larger groups, hoping to have a larger impact on the world. Eventually, these groups, these unions of workers, grow larger and larger, spreading throughout all the workers in one factory, and then entire industries, and then entire nations and international organizations. Just like capitalism centralized the workers in the cities, it also centralizes workers in labor unions. During the creation of these larger and larger organizations, business owners, who have very much to lose if these organizations are successful in demanding higher wages and better working conditions, will and have done their best to stop this inevitable development. This is where the police were formed in most of Europe, as the business owners needed an armed force to break those workers' strikes, and figured it would be easier if they just made one and all chipped in to support it. But the strategy of brutalizing protesters is only so effective, and so some of the more savvy business owners instead look to redirect this anger against mutual enemies, or, lacking that, perceived mutual enemies. You know, like the lizard people or global elites. Divide and conquer. Once the war is over and the military tribunals are concluded, because the economy itself hasn't been restructured, work is still shitty, and unions inevitably form again. They, again, eventually begin to form coalitions of unions, coordinating workers in entire blocks of the economy. Historically speaking, this is how workers have been able to claw their way out of the absolute worst parts of capitalism. This is how workers in most of the West won the 8-hour workday, the weekend, and got rid of some kinds of child labor in certain areas. This is all fantastic, but this is where the manifesto goes from explaining working class history to diagnosing fundamental problems and proposing long-term systemic solutions. As you might have seen, in recent years, child labor has been making a bit of a sequel debut, and this is what truly shows the shortcoming of merely union organization. These labor regulations, being unprofitable and therefore going against the holy scripture of the profit motive, are inevitably repealed, or at least worked around. Just one recent example is the rise in the quote-unquote gig economy, which was initially marketed as a way for workers to make their own schedules, but is in reality used to get around existing labor regulations by reclassifying employees as independent contractors. This here is what sets communism apart from other less effective ideologies. Communism seeks to fight the root cause of these issues, the profit motive, and to restructure society to negate it. As you might expect though, those who have come to control the entire planet by following this profit motive aren't particularly likely to want to get rid of it. This is why communists are so obsessed with the working class. The historical development of capitalism shows that the working class suffers the worst under the profit motive system, and so are more likely to get rid of it. Not only that, but they are also likely to engage in rebellion against the status quo just in general. They also have an observable tendency to join together in communal organizations, centralizing their class in the way that the capitalists centralized the economy. This makes the working class the quote-unquote revolutionary class, the people most likely to abolish the profit motive and create a new economic system, just like the business owners did with the previous system. There is one important difference, however. The working class is by far and away the vast majority of people on Earth. Like more than 100 to 1. This is unprecedented, as the previous economic revolutions have all been minority classes replacing other minority classes. But a workers' revolution would be a mass movement against a ruling minority, meaning that it has a very real potential to topple the system of classes in and of itself. The system of separating a small ruling elite from the majority of the laboring masses that has persisted, at least in Europe, since before the Roman Empire, could now be completely abolished. And a new world that has one class that shares all the work and all the profits would be within reach. That's communism.
Wow. That's a beautiful vision there, Mr. Marx. How exactly do you propose creating such a utopian future, you naive little...
Well, if you've been paying attention, the historical development of capitalism already showed us exactly how to do so. It's got a built-in self-destruct button, a fault in the design, the ventilation shaft in the Death Star. Okay, back up. So business owners have control because they have all the money, right? Well, they can only have all the money because the wage labor system exists. The wage labor system only exists because there are large groups of people that must sell their time in order to pay for bills, which only happened because people have been consolidated into cities. And they were only consolidated into cities because the shared land was privatized. That is the ultimate cause. Private ownership over the ways that people feed and house themselves, which can mean privately owned land, businesses, farms, and so on. The means of production is the general term for all of these things, and that's exactly what communists want to return to shared ownership. Workers and communists. Okay, so now we've got an idea of the worldview and the aims of the communists. But if someone asks me, what should I really say is a communist? Well, a communist is a proud, full-voiced advocate for the interests of the working class. Someone who advocates for things that make working people's lives better, regardless of the consequences for the business owners, even if they themselves come from that class. Part of this includes supporting the integration of the working class into one international, organized body that allows them to act as one. This means that a communist, by definition, must advocate for the integration of all races, genders, nationalities, and so on. Isolating parts of the working class from one another is inherently an obstacle to the aims of the communist, and so intersectional solidarity is a core prerequisite. A communist is also someone who analyzes the stage of the class struggle as it is, and pushes to bring about the next stage, while still keeping in mind their overall goal at the top of the ladder, the abolition of individual ownership over business. And similarly, what is a capitalist? Well, this answer might be somewhat less sensational than what you might expect. A capitalist isn't simply someone that supports the free market. A capitalist isn't simply the people that own the businesses. In fact, capitalist isn't a label applied to certain people, but rather a social status within the overall economy. Capitalist isn't an immutable trait like hair color, or even a social construct like race. But a capitalist is a role that people play in the functioning of the economy. The people that have, and more importantly, use capital. Okay, so what is capital? In many cases, you can think about capital as money, but that said, it's not exactly interchangeable. To explain, let's think about workers. They work for money, right? And some of them, like accountants or football players or VTubers, make a lot of it for their work. But they're not necessarily capitalists. Why? Well, because that money they use to pay for housing, for food, for education, or maybe even just for fancy TVs and expensive cars. None of these makes the money that they're spending capital. Money only becomes capital when they use it to start a business of their own, or to invest in an existing business for the sake of making money by getting profits from that business. Put simply, capital is money when it's invested. And so capitalists are the people that make their livings from profits rather than work. Now that all of your questions are answered and there are absolutely no possible concepts that are unclear, the manifesto moves on to address counterarguments against the communists. Some of these you'll still hear from actual grown adults, despite the fact that the manifesto is from 150 years ago, which is really just a testament to the extreme incuriosity of anti-communists. Alright, first up is a classic.
Communists are coming for your toothbrush!
Supporters of capitalism will often say that abolishing quote-unquote private property means that you won't be able to have your own possessions. But if you've been paying even a little bit of attention, you can tell that right off the bat this is a misunderstanding of the concept of private property. Communists don't care about your vintage 1978 Scooby-Doo mug in the slightest. They care about the small group of people that own the vintage 1978 Scooby-Doo mug factory. Communists only want to abolish private ownership over businesses, not goods, and allow the good people of the 1978 vintage Scooby-Doo mug factory to dictate their own lives.
Okay, but if people don't have to work for a living, then they'll become lazy.
This one was a little bit more popular before 2020, but seems to have become somewhat less popular since then. I wonder why. But the manifesto responds either way. The world is already, by definition, run by people who don't work for a living. But the world still runs, and the occasional member of the idle rich still does go to the office at the companies that they own, and every once in a while they even accidentally do some work. Clearly people don't need to be bullied into working under the threat of death.
Communists want to abolish the family!
Alright, as crazy as this one might sound at first blush, there is a grain of truth to this one. Remember back
27 minutes and 30 seconds
into the video when we were talking about the way that the business owner class views the economy got imposed onto every part of the world? If you're able to reach that far back into the depths of time, you might also remember that we discussed how that impacted the structure of the family. Long story short, it made the heterosexual married nuclear family the default family, and in fact worked that into the economy by making this default family the smallest unit within the economy. Within this unit, economic roles were imposed, making men breadwinners, women domestic slaves, and implicitly framing children as sources of free labor. This is what communists want to abolish. Their target isn't men being fathers or women being mothers, but imposed social structures and economic hierarchies that are standardized and enforced by the world economy. Communists only want to liberate the family from the economic and political hierarchies imposed on it by capitalism. In fact, this process has already begun. It began when women were, in some places, allowed to join the workforce, and when, in some places, the legal prohibition on non-heterosexual marriage was lifted. Communists seek merely to accelerate and enable this liberation.
Communists hate America!
Yes. I'll just allow the manifesto to speak for itself here. The worker has no country. The concept of a country as a specific territory with a single economic, political, and linguistic area in and of itself was created by and for the business owner class, and it continues to serve only their interests to this day. If you don't believe me, let me remind you of the US government's views on your opinion compared to that of the rich. The state that rules over the land you live on claims to serve all the people that live there, but in fact only serves the people who buy and sell your time and effort. Worse than that, when that group of business owners runs into a conflict with another group of business owners in a different place, you are forcibly thrown onto a battlefield with other workers that speak a different language from you, and you are forced to murder or be murdered. Does that sound like an organization that really serves your interests? No. This sounds like an organization that views you first and foremost as a commodity, and so logically, you don't owe that organization any more loyalty than a commodity. You don't owe your government any more loyalty and support than a book owes the town in which it was printed.
Communists want to destroy Christianity!
They got us here, gang. Pack up the
Communism.
machine and let's roll out. Communists do actually want to destroy the structures of domination that needlessly put some people in positions of power over others. And one of these structures is unfortunately organized religion. I know, if there's one thing that everyone is a huge fan of, it's organized religion. But let me do my typical little SJW worming out of the consequences of a point I've just made. In the USSR and other early socialist experiments, the state enforced an official atheism, which is undeniably caused problems for normal everyday people and bred resentment against the state. Hot take here, but that was bad. In fact, most serious communists in the year of our Lord 2023 would agree, and going forward they would not advocate for this repression. Communists never cared what you believed in your own little brain. What they aimed to do was limit the use of the church or synagogue or mosque to exploit common people for the benefit of the people in power. And this objective can be accomplished without punishing people or their religious beliefs.
Okay, well, this all sounds great, but how in the heck are you gonna bring out this naive utopian vision?
Well, it's gonna be different in different places, obviously. Thai peasants don't have the same issues that American plumbers do, and they'll both have to have their own solutions. That said, there will probably be some shared ideas. Number one is easy. Say it with me now. The abolition of the private ownership of businesses. Land, factories, and businesses will all be taken from the business owners and given to workers or an organization accountable to them. 2. The tax system will be reformed to make it impossible to accumulate the absurd amounts of money that capitalists have now. 3. The abolition of ownership inheritance. This means that trust fund babies won't be able to inherit complete control over businesses with valuations bigger than many countries. Not that you won't be able to inherit your dad's sick-ass Funko Pop collection. 4. Confiscate property abandoned by the fleeing business owners. After every revolution, elites tend to leave the country with whatever they can carry to avoid the consequences of their actions. What they leave behind will be redistributed among the workers. Number 5. Abolish private banking by incorporating private banks into the national bank. This way, people won't be able to make money by gambling on loans, like the capitalists did with mortgages leading up to 2008 when the market took a massive shit in its pants, leading to the death of thousands of people. 6. All transportation and communication infrastructure will be made communally owned. This means free internet and high-speed public transit for everyone. No brainer there. 7. Create a national economic plan to make sure everyone's needs are met. You can't grow the food to give people if you don't have an accurate estimate of how much food everyone will need in a given year. In the past few decades, it's been proposed that this could be automated, and actually Walmart has created an automated economic plan along these lines for its own company that works very well. 8. Make it a duty for everyone that can to do the work. Business owners currently use the threat of starvation for this, but with the communists in charge, it'll probably be something more like jury duty. 9. Merge agricultural and industrial sectors, which will allow people to live where they want without having to cluster in cities against their will. And finally, but most importantly, IMHO. 10. Create a system of free education for all and the complete and permanent abolition of child labor. Clearly, these 10 proposals will not completely solve every issue in a given society, and other problems will arise that will require other solutions. But step 1 will begin with this 10-point plan. Once all the issues left over from the previous economic order have been addressed, and the new unique issues that will inevitably arise after the transition away from capitalism have been addressed, the reasons for the existence of the state in its current form will be removed. and then it will begin to wither, becoming something completely unrecognizable. Thus, the remaining society will be a stateless, classless, and moneyless society. In other words, communism. 3. Socialist and communist literature. Now that we're all clear on what a communist is, how they see the world, and what they want, we can begin to look at tangentially related movements, many of which use similar language to describe themselves. Several of these are wildly irrelevant in current year, but I'm going to go over them anyways because I enjoy wasting my time and also yours. Also, it helps people show where anti-communists distort communism to suit their own purposes. First up, we've got feudal socialism. As you might have guessed based on the title, this one isn't particularly popular anymore. Essentially, this was a movement from primarily the feudal kings of Europe in the 17 and 1800s, who could see the writing on the wall. The business owners were the new big kahunas in European society, and the kings were pissy about having to give up the privileges that they had done so little work to earn. So what they advocated for was the kings and the emerging working class teaming up to take on the capitalists like the worst kind of flip-top yogurt cup. I don't understand that line. So what they advocated for was the kings and the emerging working class teaming up to take on the capitalists in the world's first class-based wombo combo. It should be immediately obvious what this is: merely monarchists trying to maintain the feudal order by weakly attempting to use the working class against the business owner class. Communists, by definition, do not support the existence of classes, and that includes the feudal monarch class. Next comes an ideology that emerged in what would become Germany during the 1800s. This is quote-unquote German, or true socialism, which advocated for the emerging working class throwing in their lot with the business owners or kings, depending on which had more power in that particular place at the time. While it isn't in and of itself a bad thing to work with members of classes outside the working class, as long as they're willing to subject themselves to the will of the working class, the line comes to the distortion of communist ideology. Quote-unquote German socialists didn't see much beyond the replacing of the current dominant class, kings, or business owners, with the other of the two dominant classes, the other king or business owner. And thus it did not advocate openly for the needs of the workers. That's a no-no in communism. Now we come to something that's actually vaguely relevant to your life: conservative socialism. In modern English, these people might be referred to as democratic socialists or social democrats. Yes, Bernard Hussein Sanders, I'm talking to you. These people, who generally come from the upper classes of society themselves, take pity on the conditions of the working class and want to improve their conditions, but without taking away from their own elevated positions. This generally results in something like the systems in Scandinavian countries, where businesses and the government are still entirely controlled by the business owners, but the absolute worst parts of capitalism have been made illegal. This might take the form of a universal housing guarantee, but in order to qualify for that housing, you have to go to a government office to fill out paperwork, or you must prove that you're a citizen, that you speak the language, and that you have a job, and so on. Once you finally jump through all of these hoops, you're put onto a wait list that's thousands of people long, and it's projected to take 3 years for your name to reach the top. But 2 years into this wait, universal housing is repealed, and you're still houseless. Of course, that's just the beginning of the issues with this form of quote-unquote socialism, but it illustrates the underlying issue. The business owner class still runs society. The last ideology that the manifesto touches on here is critical utopian socialism, and it fills an interesting role here. This was the first form of socialism, where people would retreat to the wilderness to build new societies and spaces between the old that catered to everyone's needs, and they were often based on explicitly Christian values. These were popular in Europe and even in America throughout the 1800s, and arguably saw a resurgence starting in the 1960s with the hippie movement. Historically, most of these societies lasted at most a few decades, and very few remain intact to this day. The manifesto attributes these kinds of experiments to failing to pass through the stages of societal development needed to create the desired kind of society. Essentially, these experiments didn't have the economic and technological developments provided by capitalism that are necessary in order to build the next stage of human society. And with that, we've come to the end of the Communist Manifesto. It wasn't that bad after all, huh? It only took
37
minutes. And now, all of your questions about communism are completely answered, and there's no vagueness whatsoever. Really though, if you come to the end of this video and find yourself with more questions than when you started, you're actually doing it right, believe it or not. Communism is an extremely deep, complex, and nuanced school of thought that influences pretty much every single aspect of the human experience. And it's had about 150 years to grow and diversify since the manifesto was published. If you're new to all this, I hope that this video at least gave you a little tiny bit of clarity and maybe a little bit of curiosity about the movement. If you're old to this, tell me what you liked about this simplified summary, what you think I left out, and leave your reading recommendations for me in the comments. And everyone, young, old, and immortal timeless beings alike, should at some point in their lives read the manifesto itself. This video is released in conjunction with an audio recording of the book, and a free PDF of the text is linked in the description, so you don't really have an excuse.